All right, guys. So I am still away, but I'm filming this in advance. So please forgive me. No live segment today. You're going to have to deal with this dastardly pre recorded segment. I have 10 reasons why vintage watches are making a comeback at the end of 2024. Now, I know I have a dog in the fight. I love vintage watches. I'm a vintage watch geek, and I have a vintage watch shop. So, take everything I say with a grain of salt. The truth is, I'm just trying to get you to shop at my store. I'm just kidding. Let's get into the episode. It is 7:06 p.m. Let's get down to business. So each point in today's list is something I think is being rediscovered by a lot of watch enthusiasts and a lot of watch publications. I've noticed recently Hodinkee is writing even more regularly about vintage watches, which makes me very happy because I think Hodinkee recently, like in the last week or so, since they've kind of made a shift back to where they used to be, I think they've been putting out a lot of really good content. And I'm not a Hodinkee fan, all right, Ben? Don't get super excited. I'm watching you still. But I am very excited to see where you go. And I think, like I said, it's not just Hodinkee. Other watch publications and other watch enthusiasts have been paying more attention to the points I'm going to bring up today. First, historical value. Obviously, watches that are old have more history, and I think people are appreciating them, and I think there's a reason why. People pay attention more to the historical value of some of these watches because watchmakers are starting to offer more and more heritage models. So, like reissues and kind of visits when it comes to watches that they offered decades and decades ago. Next, I think a lot of people are reappreciating these kind of interesting Art Deco old school designs that were very prominent way back when. I mean, things all happen in cycles, and I think now a lot of people really appreciate kind of the smaller profile, interesting, sometimes asymmetrical designs that were very, very common with vintage watches. The next thing that I think a lot of people really appreciate when it comes to vintage watches, and it depends where you shop and it depends what you buy, and hopefully not too many people pay attention to this point, but you often can get some pretty cool watches from some pretty cool brands for not as much money than their modern offerings if you go vintage. Now, that's not always the case. Vintage Rolexes often skyrocket. Vintage Vacheron, vintage Patek, vintage vintage Vacheron, vintage Patek, vintage AP. These all go up, up, and up. But there's some really cool vintage Longines, vintage Wittenauer, vintage brands that I love that you can get really, really impressive specs and you're not spending a ton of money. Now, here's what I will tell you as well. You can get burned very badly buying a vintage watch and spending any money on it if it's not authentic. So please, if you need help, I've made a ton of videos talking about what to look for. I'm just saying, you can get into some really cool brands going vintage, and you don't have to cough up as much money as you would if you were buying a modern version of a watch from that brand. Next up, nostalgia. I mean, again, this all comes in cycles, but I think there's some nostalgia value. People are, I don't want to say hearkening back to the good old days, because the truth is I wasn't around in 1940. But 1940 and that decade is an awesome era of wristwatch. I think it is, though, kind of going back to when things were simpler. And although I don't understand what it was actually like then, simpler times, and again, 1940s weren't necessarily simpler, the whole war and stuff, but wristwatches definitely were simpler. And having something that's time only, having something that's hand wound, seems fun. Kind of nostalgic, maybe a more romanticized image of what life was like way back when. People are coming around to it, which brings us to our next point, patina. Okay, I know some people hate it, but a lot of people really love it, and finely patinated wristwatches often go for more money than their cleaner counterparts, and it's because patina has character, and it's been worn well, and very desirable and sought after, and artsy, and ooh, very nice. I really love the tropical dial. Tropical's just a nice way of saying a black dial that's turned brown. Next up, rarity. Okay, I know we've mentioned that you sometimes can find more affordable options on the vintage market. Well, there's a total flip side to that. There are a lot of very rare, very valuable pieces in the vintage market, and that's why a lot of collectors who end up getting into some money or who are willing to spend more money end up investing in vintage pieces because they know that when auction comes around, or if they want to sell something or whatever, prices skyrocket. Like we saw this with the Rolex 1016, right? Like back in 2015, you could get one for around 10 grand. Now you're looking 20 and up. And that's just one example. This next point I want to bring up is kind of crunchy granola, dare I say, a little bit hippy dippy, but I've heard it being spoken about, and I guess I gotta repeat it. People have made the argument that vintage watches are sustainable, and that's why a lot of these, hoity-toity rich elite are going back to vintage watches. Now, I don't think that's actually why they're doing it. I think that they're just really rich, and they want to show up at the red carpet with some really obscure, very expensive watch, and then to justify it, they say, oh, well, also, it's sustainable. It's more eco-friendly because this watch is really old, so I'm upcycling it and wearing it again. Again, I don't think that really comes into play here, but if that is contributing to more popularity in the vintage market, hey, I'm all for it. Buy a watch from me. It's eco-friendly. Now, this last point I want to bring up, I kind of touched upon earlier when we spoke about rarity, but there is investment potential with vintage watches. Now, nothing on my channel ever is financial advice, but you can make money buying vintage watches if you do your research, if you ask the right questions, if you buy at the right place, at the right time. There's a whole lot of really cool, valuable vintage watches that you can scoop up if you have the money to spend. So again, I don't recommend collecting watches as an investment, but the vintage watch market is just ripe for the picking. So there you have it, guys. 10 reasons why vintage watch collecting is making a comeback at the end of 2024. Again, this is not a live segment. We will return to the daily live shows when I return to the office. Hope you don't mind having a nice edited episode every once in a while. And yeah, guys, I'm Jory Goodman, the time teller. And always remember, I didn't invent time. I just tell it.